The Inner Timekeepers. Ask me why I can't tell a good joke. Okay, why can't you? Poor timing. The best comedians display an effortless sense of rhythm, a feel for timing that makes their jokes work. Like concert musicians examining a musical score, professionals in the world of comedy can analyze precisely how many beats to pause before delivering a punchline, or exactly when to interrupt, as in this joke about timing. Getting the beat just right ensures that a joke will be delivered artfully. Nature loves good timing. The sciences find synchronies throughout the natural world, whenever one natural process entrains or oscillates in rhythm with another. When waves are out of sync, they cancel each other. When they synchronize, they amplify. In the natural world, pacing occurs with everything from ocean waves to heartbeats. In the interpersonal realm, our emotional rhythms entrain. When a human Zeitgeber draws us into an upbeat range, they do us a favor. And when we do the same for someone else, we pass that favor on. To witness such entrainment, watch any virtuoso display of musical prowess. The musicians themselves seem enraptured, swaying as one in rhythm with the music. But beneath this visible synchrony, the musicians are joined in a way an audience can never know, in their brains. If any two of those musicians were to have their neural activity measured during their rapture, it would show a remarkable synchronicity. For instance, when two cellists play the same bit of music, the rhythms of neuronal firing in their right hemispheres are extraordinarily close. The synchrony of these zones for musical abilities is far greater across brains of the two than is the case for the left and right hemispheres within each brain. Whenever we find ourselves in such harmony with someone else, we can thank what neuroscientists call oscillators, neural systems that act like clocks, resetting over and over their rate of firing to coordinate with the periodicity of an incoming signal. That signal may be as simple as the rate at which a friend hands you the dishes she's washed so you can dry them, or as complex as the movements in a well-choreographed pas de deux. While we take such everyday coordination for granted, elegant mathematical models have been developed describing the logarithms that allow for this micromeshing. That neural math applies whenever we time our movements to the outer world, not just with other people, but also, say, when intercepting a soccer ball at top speed or hitting a 95-mile-per-hour pitch. The rhythmic undertones and fluid synchrony of even the barest interactions can be as remarkably complex as the improvised coordination of jazz. If such meshing were true only, say, for nodding, there would be little surprise, but the entrainment goes further. Consider the many ways we mesh movements. As two people are engrossed in conversation, their body's motion seems to track the very pace and structure of their speech. Frame-by-frame analyses of pairs talking reveal how each person's movements punctuate their conversation's rhythm. Head-and-hand actions coinciding with stress points and hesitations in speech. Remarkably, such body-to-speech synchronies occur within a fraction of a second. As these synchronies interlock while we speak with someone, our own thoughts can't possibly track the complexity of the dance. The body is like the brain's puppet, and the brain's clock ticks in milliseconds, or even tinier microseconds, while our conscious information processing and our thoughts about it lope along seconds at a time. Yet, outside our awareness, our body synchronizes with the subtle patterns of whomever we happen to be interacting with. Even a bit of peripheral vision offers enough information about a body-to-body linkage to set up a coupled oscillation, a tacit interpersonal synchrony. You might notice this as you walk with someone. Within minutes, both of you will be moving your hands and legs in perfect harmony, just as two pendulums swinging freely come into sync. Oscillators echo the neural equivalent of the ditty from Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Will you, won't you, will you, won't you, will you join the dance? When we are with another person, these timekeepers put us in sync unconsciously, like the flowing ease with which lovers approach for an embrace, or take each other's hands at just the right instant as they walk down the street. On the other hand, a friend tells me that when she was dating, if she kept falling out of step with the guy she was walking with, she was alerted that there might be trouble ahead. Any conversation demands that the brain make extraordinarily complex calculations, with oscillators guiding the continuous cascade of adjustments that keep us in sync. From this microsynchrony flows an affinity, as we participate in a slice of our conversational partner's very experience. We so readily slide into a brain-to-brain link, in part because we've been practicing this silent rumba all our life, since we first learned the basic moves. The proto-conversation. Picture a mother holding her baby. The mother makes an affectionate kissy face, pursing her lips. At that, her baby draws his lips inward in a somewhat sober-looking expression. The mother widens her mouth into a slight smile, and her baby relaxes his lips, hinting at widening his mouth into a grin, and mother and baby join in a slight smile. Then the baby breaks into a full-blown beam, moving his head to the side and up, almost flirtatiously. The entire interaction takes less than 3 seconds. Not much happened, yet there was a definite communication. Such rudimentary engagements are called proto-conversation, the prototype of all human interaction. Communication at its most basic. Oscillators are at work in the proto-conversation. Microanalysis reveals that babies and mothers precisely time the start, end, and pauses in their baby talk, creating a coupling of rhythm. Each captures and coordinates what they do with the timing of the other. These conversations are nonverbal, resorting to words only as sound effects. We engage in proto-conversation with the baby through our gaze, touch, and tone of voice. Messages go via smiles and coos, and most especially motherese, the adult complement to baby talk. More like a song than a sentence, motherese deploys prosody, melodic overtones of speech that transcend culture, and that are much the same whether the mother speaks Mandarin Chinese, Urdu, or English. Motherese always sounds friendly and playful, with a high pitch, around 300 hertz to be technical, and short, spiked, undulating, or gliding pitch contours. Often, a mother will synchronize motherese with patting or stroking her baby in a repeated periodic rhythm. Her face and head movements are in sync with her hands and voice, and the baby in turn responds with smiles, cooing, and movements of jaws, lips, and tongue in sync with his hand motions. Such mother-baby pirouettes are short, a matter of just seconds or even milliseconds, and they end when both partners match states, typically happy ones. Mother and infant fall into what seems much like a duet of synchronized or alternating parts, paced by a steady adagio pulse at about 90 beats per minute. Such scientific observations are made painstakingly through the tedious examination of endless hours of videotaped mother-infant interactions by developmental psychologists like Colwyn Treverton at the University of Edinburgh. Treverton's studies have made him the world expert on proto-conversation, a duet where both performers, as he describes it, seek harmony and counterpoint on one beat to create a melody. But more than marking out a kind of melody, the two are having a discussion of sorts that centers on one central theme: emotions. The frequency of the mother's touch and the sound of her voice give the baby the reassuring message of her love, resulting, as Treverton puts it, in an immediate, unverbalized, conceptless rapport. The exchange of these signals forges a link with the baby through which we can make her happy and excited, calm and quiet, or upset and in tears. During a happy proto-conversation, mother and baby feel upbeat and attuned to each other. But when either the mother or the infant fails to hold up their part of the conversation, the outcomes are quite different. If the mother, for instance, pays too little attention or responds without enthusiasm, the baby reacts by withdrawing. If the mother's responses are poorly timed, the baby will look puzzled, then distressed. And if it's the baby who fails to respond, the mother in turn will get upset. These sessions are a kind of tutorial. The proto-conversation marks a baby's first lesson in how to interact. We learn how to synchronize emotionally long before we have words for those feelings. Proto-conversations remain our most basic template for interacting, a tacit awareness that quietly gets us in step as we link with someone else. The ability to get into sync as we did when we were babies serves us through life, guiding us in every social interaction. And just as feelings were the main topic of proto-conversation for us as infants, they remained the bedrock of communication in adulthood. This silent dialogue on feelings is the substrate on which all other encounters build and the hidden agenda in every interaction. Chapter 3. Neural Wi-Fi. As I settled into a seat on a New York City subway, one of those ambiguous, possibly ominous moments of urban life occurred. I heard a shriek far behind me, from the opposite end of the car. My back was to the source of the scream, but I faced a gentleman whose face suddenly took on a slightly anxious look. My mind raced to comprehend what was going on and what, if anything, I should do. Was it a fight? Was someone running amok on the subway? Was danger headed my way? Or was it merely a shriek of delight, maybe a group of teenagers having a whooping good time? My answer came swiftly from the face of the man who could see what was happening. His worried features settled into calm, and he went back to reading his newspaper. Whatever was going on back there, I knew all was well. My initial apprehension was stoked by his, until I was calmed by seeing his face relax. In moments like my sudden wariness on the subway, we instinctively become more attentive to the faces of the people around us, searching for smiles or frowns that give us a better sense of how to interpret signs of danger, or that might signal someone's intentions. In human prehistory, a primal band with its numerous eyes and ears could be ever more vigilant for danger than could an isolated individual. And in the tooth-and-claw world of early humans, that ability to multiply sentinels and a brain mechanism attuned to pick up signs of danger automatically and mobilize fear no doubt had great survival value. Although, at the extremes of anxiety, we may become too swallowed up in our own fear to attune at all, in most of its range, anxiety heightens emotional transactions so that people who feel threatened and anxious are especially prone to catching other people's emotions. In one of those early human groups, no doubt the terrorized face of someone who had sighted a prowling tiger was enough to set off the same panic in whoever saw that expression, and set them running to safety. When two people interact face to face, contagion spreads via multiple neural circuits operating in parallel within each person's brain. These systems for emotional contagion traffic in the entire range of feeling, from sadness and anxiety to joy. Moments of contagion represent a remarkable neural event, the formation between two brains of a functional link, a feedback loop that crosses the skin and skull barrier between bodies. In systems terms, during this link-up, brains couple, with the output of one becoming input to drive the workings of the other, for the time being forming what amounts to an interbrain circuit. When two entities are connected in a feedback loop, as the first changes, so does the second. As people loop together, the brains send and receive an ongoing stream of signals that allow them to create a tacit harmony and, if the flow goes the right way, amplify their resonance. Looping lets feelings, thoughts, and actions synchronize. We send and receive internal states for better or for worse, whether laughter and tenderness or tension and rancor. In physics, the defining property of resonance is sympathetic vibration, the tendency of one part to amplify its vibratory rate by matching the pace at which another part vibrates. Such resonance produces the largest and most prolonged possible response between the two interacting parts, an afterglow. Brains loop outside our awareness, with no special attention or intention demanded. While we can intentionally try to mimic someone in order to foster closeness, such attempts tend to come off as awkward. Synchrony works best when it is spontaneous, not constructed from ulterior motives such as ingratiation or any other conscious intention. The low road's automaticity allows its rapidity. For instance, the amygdala spots signs of fear in someone's face with remarkable speed, picking it up in a glimpse as quick as 33 milliseconds, and in some people even in a mere 17 milliseconds, less than 2/100ths of a second. This quick read attests to the hyperspeed of the low road, so fast that the conscious mind remains oblivious to that perception, though we might sense the resulting vague stirring of uneasiness. We may not consciously realize how we are synchronizing, yet we mesh with remarkable ease. This spontaneous social duet is the work of a special class of neurons. Neural mirrors. I must have been just 2 or 3 years old, but the memory remains vivid in my mind. As I wandered down the aisle of the local grocery store at my mother's side, a lady spotted me, a cute little toddler, and gave me a warm smile. My own mouth, I still recall, startled me by involuntarily moving into a smile in return. It felt as though somehow my face had become puppet-like, drawn by mysterious strings that widened the muscles around my mouth and puffed out my cheeks. I distinctly felt that my smile had come unbidden, directed not from within, but from outside myself. That unbidden reaction no doubt signaled the activity of what are called mirror neurons in my young brain. Mirror neurons do just that. They reflect back an action we observe in someone else, making us mimic that action or have the impulse to do so. These do-as-she-does neurons offer a brain mechanism that explains the old lyric, "When you're smiling, the whole world smiles with you." Major lanes of the low road surely run through this kind of neuron. We have multiple systems of mirror neurons, with more being discovered as time goes on. Beyond the handful of mirror neurons that have been spotted so far, there seems to be a multitude of such neural systems that remain as yet unmapped. Neuroscientists stumbled on this neural Wi-Fi by accident in 1992. They were mapping the sensory motor area of monkeys' brains by using electrodes so laser thin they could be implanted in single brain cells, and seeing which cell lit up during a specific movement. The neurons in this area were proving to be remarkably precise. For instance, some neurons lit up only when the monkey was grasping something in its hand, others only when it was tearing it apart. But the truly unexpected discovery came one hot afternoon when a research assistant came back from a break eating an ice cream cone. The scientists were astonished to see a sensory motor cell activate as one monkey watched the assistant lift the cone to his lips. They were dumbfounded to find that a distinct set of neurons seemed to activate when the monkey merely observed another monkey, or one of the experimenters, making a given movement. Since that first sighting of mirror neurons in monkeys, the same systems have been discovered in the human brain. In a remarkable study where a laser-thin electrode monitored a single neuron in an awake person, the neuron fired both when the person anticipated pain, a pinprick, and when merely seeing someone else receive a pinprick, a neural snapshot of primal empathy in action. Many mirror neurons operate in the premotor cortex, which governs activities ranging from speaking and movement to simply intending to act. Because they're adjacent to motor neurons, their location means that the areas of the brain that initiate a movement can readily begin to activate even as we watch someone else make that same movement. When we mentally rehearse an action, making a dry run of a talk we have to give or envisioning the fine points of our golf swing, the same neurons activate in the premotor cortex as if we had uttered those words or made that swing. Simulating an act is, in the brain, the same as performing it, except that the actual execution is somehow blocked. Our mirror neurons fire as we watch someone else, for example, scratch their head or wipe away a tear, so that a portion of the pattern of neuronal firing in our brains mimics theirs. This maps the identical information from what we are seeing onto our own motor neurons, letting us participate in the other person's actions as if we were executing that action. The human brain harbors multiple mirror neuron systems, not just for mimicking actions, but also for reading intentions, for extracting the social implications from what someone does, and for reading emotions. For instance, when volunteers lay in an fMRI watching a video showing someone smile or scowl, most brain areas that activated in the observers were the same as those active in the person displaying the emotion, though not as extreme. Mirror neurons make emotions contagious, letting the feelings we witness flow through us, helping us get in sync and follow what's going on. We feel the other in the broadest sense of the word, sensing their sentiments, their movements, their sensations, their emotions, as they act inside us. Social skill depends on mirror neurons. For one thing, echoing what we observe in another person prepares us to make a speedy and fitting response. For another, the neurons respond to the mere hint of an intention to move, and they help us track what motivation may be in play. Sensing what other people intend and why offers invaluable social information, letting us keep a step ahead of whatever will happen next, like social chameleons. Mirror neurons appear to be essential to the way children learn. Imitative learning has long been recognized as a major avenue of childhood development, but our findings about mirror neurons explain how children can gain mastery simply from watching. As they watch, they are etching in their own brains a repertoire for emotion, for behavior, and for how the world works. Human mirror neurons are far more flexible and diverse than those in monkeys, reflecting our sophisticated social abilities. By mimicking what another person does or feels, mirror neurons create a shared sensibility, bringing the outside inside us. To understand another, we become like the other, at least a bit. That virtual sense of what someone else experiences fits with an emerging notion in the philosophy of mind, that we understand others by translating their actions into the neural language that prepares us for the same actions and lets us experience alike. I understand your action by creating a template for it in my own brain. As Giacomo Rizzolatti, the Italian neuroscientist who discovered mirror neurons, explains, these systems allow us to grasp the minds of others not through conceptual reasoning, but through direct simulation, by feeling, not by thinking. This triggering of parallel circuitry in two brains lets us instantly achieve a shared sense of what counts in a given moment. This creates an immediacy, a sense of sharing the moment. Neuroscientists call that mutually reverberating state empathic resonance, a brain-to-brain linkage that forms a two-person circuitry via the low road. The external signs of such interlinks have been detailed by an American psychiatrist working at the University of Geneva, Daniel Stern, who has for decades made systematic observations of mothers and infants. A developmental scientist in the tradition of Jean Piaget, Stern also explores adult interactions, such as between psychotherapists and their clients, or between lovers. Stern concludes that our nervous systems are constructed to be captured by the nervous systems of others so that we can experience others as if from within their skin. At such moments, we resonate with their experience, and they with ours. We can no longer, Stern adds, see our minds as so independent, separate, and isolated, but instead, we must view them as permeable, continually interacting as though joined by an invisible link. At an unconscious level, we are in constant dialogue with anyone we interact with, our every feeling and very way of moving attuned to theirs. At least for the moment, our mental life is co-created in an interconnected two-person matrix. The wiring of the facial muscles ensures that the emotions that swirl within us will be displayed for others to read, unless we actively suppress them. And mirror neurons ensure that the moment someone sees an emotion expressed on your face, they will at once sense that same feeling within themselves. And so our emotions are experienced not merely by ourselves in isolation, but also by those around us, both covertly and openly. Stern suggests that the neurons for mimicry are at play whenever we sense another person's state of mind and resonate with their feelings. This interbrain linkage makes bodies move in tandem, thoughts go down the same roads, and emotions run along the same lines. As mirror neurons bridge brains, they create a tacit duet that opens the way for subtle but powerful transactions. The happy face advantage. When I first met Paul Ekman in the 1980s, he had just spent a year gazing into a mirror while learning to voluntarily control each one of the close to 200 muscles of the face. This entailed some heroic scientific research. He had to apply a mild electrical shock to locate some hard-to-detect facial muscles. Once he had mastered his feat of self-control, he was able to map precisely how different sets of these muscles move to exhibit each of the major emotions in their variations. Ekman has identified 18 kinds of smiles, all various permutations of the 15 facial muscles involved. To name but a few, a miserable smile pastes over an unhappy expression, like a grin and bear it comment on feeling dismal. A cruel smile shows that the person relishes being angry and mean. And then there's the supercilious smile that was Charlie Chaplin's hallmark, which draws on a muscle most people can't move deliberately. A smile, as Ekman puts it, that smiles at smiling. Of course, there are also genuine smiles of spontaneous pleasure or amusement. These are the smiles that are most likely to evoke one in return. That action signals the work of mirror neurons dedicated to detecting smiles and triggering our own. As a Tibetan saying has it, when you smile at life, half the smile is for your face, the other half for somebody else's. Smiles have an advantage over all other emotional expressions. The human brain prefers happy faces, recognizing them more readily and quickly than those with negative expressions, an effect known as the happy face advantage. Some neuroscientists suggest that the brain has a system for positive feelings that stays primed for activity, causing people to be in positive moods more often than negative, and to have a more positive outlook on life. That implies that nature tends to foster positive relationships. Despite the all too prominent place of aggression in human affairs, we are not innately primed to dislike people from the start. Even among complete strangers, a moment of playfulness, even outright silliness, forms an instant resonance. In what may be yet another instance of psychology trying to prove the obvious, pairs of strangers were assigned to play a series of silly games together. During the games, one person had to talk through a straw while directing the other, wearing a blindfold, to toss a Nerf ball back and forth. The strangers invariably fell into guffaws at their haplessness. When strangers played the same silly games without the blindfold and straw, however, they never cracked a smile. Yet the laughing pairs felt a strong, immediate sense of closeness, even after spending just a few minutes together. Indeed, laughter may be the shortest distance between two brains, an unstoppable infectious spread that builds an instant social bond. Take two teenage girls giggling together. The more giddily playful the two teen best friends become, the more synchronous, animated, and happy they feel together. In other words, they resonate. What to a parent may seem an ungodly racket will be, for the teenagers making it, one of their most bonding moments. Meme wars. Since the 1970s, rap songs have glorified the thug's life, with its guns and drugs, gang violence, and misogyny, and the pimp's and hustler's lust for bling. But that seems to be changing, as have the lives of some of those who write such lyrics. It seems like hip-hop has mostly been about parties and guns and women, Darryl McDaniels, the DMC in the rap group Run DMC, has acknowledged. But McDaniels, who himself prefers listening to classical rock rather than rap, adds, "That's fine if you're in a club, but from 9 a.m. till I went to bed at night, the music had nothing to say to me." His complaint heralds the emergence of a new breed of rap music, one that embraces a more wholesome, if still grittily frank, view of life. As one of these reformed rappers, John Stevens, known as Legend, admits, "I wouldn't feel comfortable making music that glorifies violence or such things." Instead, Legend, like his fellow rap performer Kanye West, has turned to lyrics in a positive key that mix confessional self-criticism with wry social commentary. That nuanced sensibility reflects their life experience, which has followed paths markedly different from those of most gangster rap stars of the past. Stevens has a degree from the University of Pennsylvania, and Kanye is the son of a college professor. As Kanye observes, "My mom's a teacher, and I'm kind of a teacher too." He's onto something. Rap lyrics, like any poem, essay, or news story, can be seen as delivery systems for memes, ideas that spread from mind to mind, much as emotions do. The notion of a meme was modeled on that of a gene, an entity that replicates itself by getting passed on from person to person. Memes with particular power, like democracy or cleanliness, lead us to act in a specific way. They're ideas with impact. Some memes naturally oppose others, and when they do, these memes are at war, a battle of ideas. Memes seem to gather power from the low road, through their association with strong emotions. An idea matters to us to the extent that it moves us, and that is precisely what emotions do. The low-road force of rap lyrics, or any song, made all the stronger by oscillator-riveting beats, may gather special force, certainly more than they would have read on a page. Memes may one day be understood as mirror neurons at work. Their unconscious scripting steers much of what we do, particularly when we are on automatic. But the subtle power of memes to make us act often eludes detection. Consider their surprising power to prime social interactions. In an experiment, One group of volunteers heard a list of cue cards that referred to impoliteness, such as rude and obnoxious, while another group heard cue words like considerate and polite. They then were put in a situation where they had to deliver a message to someone who was talking with another person. 2 out of 3 of those primed for rudeness butted in to interrupt, while 8 of 10 primed for politeness waited the full 10 minutes for the conversation to end before speaking up. In another form of priming, an unnoticed cue can lead to surprising synchronicities. How else to explain what happened when my wife and I visited a tropical island? One morning, we spotted a marvel far out on the horizon, a strikingly graceful 4-masted ship sailing by. My wife suggested I take a photo, so I dug out my camera and snapped one. It was the first time I'd taken a photo in the 10 days we'd been there. A few hours later, as we left for lunch, I decided to take the camera along and slipped it into a backpack. As we walked toward a lunch shack on a beach nearby, it occurred to me to mention that I had the camera along with me. But out of the blue, before I could say a word, my wife asked, "Did you bring the camera?" It was as though she had read my mind. Such synchronicities seem to stem from the verbal equivalent of emotional contagion. Our trains of association run on set tracks, circuits of learning and memory. Once any of these trains has been primed, even by a simple mention, that track stirs in the unconscious, beyond the reach of our active attention. As the Russian playwright Anton Chekhov famously put it, never put a gun on a wall in the second act of a play without using it by the end of the third, for the audience will be expecting gunshots. Because simply thinking of an action prepares the mind to perform it, priming guides us through our daily routines without our having to exert mental effort in thinking what we should do next, something like a mental to-do list. Seeing our toothbrush on the bathroom sink in the morning cues us to automatically reach for it and start brushing. This urge to enact guides us everywhere. When someone whispers to us, we whisper back. Talk about a Grand Prix race to someone driving on a highway, and he will speed up. It's as though one brain implants similar feelings, thoughts, and impulses in the other. In similar fashion, parallel trains of thought can lead two people to think, do, or say virtually the same thing at the same moment. When my wife and I suddenly attuned to the identical thought, presumably some shared momentary perception had triggered an identical train of association, bringing to mind the camera. Such mental intimacy bespeaks an emotional closeness. The more satisfied and communicative a couple, the more accurate their mutual mind reading. When we know someone well, or experience strong rapport, conditions are near optimal for a confluence of our internal thoughts, feelings, perceptions, and memories. We are in what amounts to a mind meld where we tend to perceive, think, and feel in the same way as the other person. Such convergence goes on even when strangers become friends. Take 2 college students assigned to the same dorm room. Researchers at Berkeley recruited new roommates and tracked their emotional responses as they separately watched some short films. One featured Robin Williams in a hilarious comedy. Another, a tearjerker, depicted a boy crying at the death of his father. On first viewing the films, the new roommates reacted as differently from one another as any pair of random strangers would. But 7 months later, when the researchers invited the roommates back to see similar short films, their reactions had converged strikingly. The madness of crowds. They call them super hooligans, the gangs of soccer fans who spark riots and mass fights at European matches. The formula for a soccer riot is the same, no matter the country. A small, tight-knit gang of fans arrives for the match hours early and goes out on a drinking binge, singing their club songs and having a rollicking time. Then, as the crowds are gathering for the match, the gangs get caught up in waving team flags, singing boisterous songs, and chanting against the other team, all of which spreads to the gathering mass. The super hooligans gravitate to points where their team's fans mix with those of their rivals, and the chants change to outright threats. Then comes the flashpoint, when a gang leader attacks a rival fan, triggering others to join in, and the fights spread. That formula for violent mass hysteria has been repeated over and over since the early 1980s, with tragic consequences. In a drunken, belligerent mob, conditions are ideal for sparking violence. The alcohol disinhibits neural controls over impulses, and so the moment a leader models the first carnage, Contagion primes the rest to follow. Elias Canetti, in his study Crowds in Power, observes that what coalesces a mass of individuals into a crowd is their domination by a single passion everyone shares, a common emotion that leads to united action, collective contagion. A mood can sweep through a group with great rapidity, a remarkable display of the parallel alignment of biological subsystems that puts everyone there in physiological synchrony. The swiftness of shifts in the activity of crowds looks suspiciously like mirror neuron coordination writ large. Crowd decision-making goes on within seconds, presumably the time it takes for a person-to-person transmission of mirror neuron synchrony to sweep through, though for now that remains a matter of speculation. Group contagion in its more sedate forms can be witnessed at any great performance, where actors or musicians create a field effect, playing the audience's emotions like instruments. Plays, concerts, and movies all let us enter a shared field of emotions with large numbers of strangers. Looping together in an upbeat register is, as psychologists like to say, inherently reinforcing. That is, it makes everyone feel good. Crowd contagion goes on even in the most minimal of groups, 3 people sitting face to face with each other in silence for a few minutes. In the absence of a power hierarchy, the person with the most emotionally expressive face will set the shared tone. Contagion will seep through almost any coordinated collection of people. Take an experiment in high-stakes decision-making, where a group met to decide how much of a bonus to give each employee from an end-of-year pool of money. Each person in the meeting was trying to get as large a bonus as possible for one or another employee, while still making the best overall distribution for the group as a whole. The conflicting agendas led to tension, and by the end of the meeting, everyone was feeling distressed. But in a meeting of another group with an identical goal, everyone ended up feeling good about the outcome. The 2 meetings were business simulations done in a now classic study at Yale University, where volunteers were put in groups to make the bonus decisions. No one knew that one of the participants in each meeting was actually a seasoned actor whose secret assignment was to be confrontational and downbeat with some of the groups and helpful and upbeat with the others. In whichever direction his emotions went, his lead was followed. The group members showed a distinct shift in their own mood, becoming upset or feeling pleasant accordingly. But none of the group members seemed to know why their mood had changed. Unwittingly, they had been looped into a mood shift. The feelings that pass through a group can bias how all the group members process information, and hence the decisions they make. This suggests that in coming to a decision together, any group would do well to attend not just to what's being said, but to the shared emotions in the room as well. This convergence bespeaks a subtle, inexorable magnetism, a gravity-like pull toward thinking and feeling alike about things in general among people who are in close relationships of any kind, family members, workmates, and friends. Chapter 4. An Instinct for Altruism. One afternoon at the Princeton Theological Seminary, 40 students waited to give a short practice sermon on which way they would be rated. Half the students had been assigned random biblical topics. The other half had been assigned the parable of the Good Samaritan who stopped to help a stranger by the roadside, an injured man ignored by people supposedly more pious. The seminarians worked together in a room, and every 15 minutes one of them left to go to another building to deliver their sermon. None knew they were taking part in an experiment on altruism. Their route passed directly by a doorway in which a man was slumped, groaning in evident pain. Of the 40 students, 24 passed right by, ignoring the plaintive moans, and those who were mulling over the lessons of the Good Samaritan's tale were no more likely to stop and help than were any of the others. For the seminarians, time mattered. Among 10 who thought they were late to give their sermon, only 1 stopped. Among another 10 who thought they had plenty of time, 6 offered help. Of the many factors that are at play in altruism, a critical one seems to be simply taking the time to pay attention. Our empathy is strongest to the degree we fully focus on someone and so loop emotionally. People differ, of course, in their ability, willingness, and interest in paying attention. A sullen teen can tune out her mother's nagging, then a minute later have undivided concentration while on a phone call to her girlfriend. The seminarians rushing to give their sermon were apparently unwilling or unable to give their attention to the moaning man, presumably because they were caught up in their thoughts and the press of hurrying, and so never attuned to him, let alone helped him. People on busy streets worldwide are less likely to notice, greet, or offer help to someone else because of what has been called the urban trance. Sociologists have proposed that we tend to fall into this self-absorbed state on crowded streets, if only to gird against stimulus overload from the swirl around us. Inevitably, the strategy requires a trade-off. We shut out the compelling needs of those around us along with the mere distractions. As a poet put it, we confront the noise of the street, dazed and deafened. In addition, social divides shutter our eyes. A homeless person sitting dejectedly on the street of an American city asking for money may receive no attention from passers-by, who a few steps away will gladly listen and respond to a well-dressed, outgoing woman asking for signatures on a political petition. Of course, depending on our sympathies, the attention we give may be just the reverse: sympathy for the homeless person, but none for the political appeal. In short, our priorities, socialization, and myriad other social psychological factors can lead us to direct or inhibit our attention or the emotions we feel, and thus our empathy. Simply paying attention allows us to build an emotional connection. Lacking attention, empathy hasn't a chance. When attention must be paid. Contrast those events at the Princeton Seminary with what happened one rush hour in New York City as I headed for the Times Square subway station after work one day. As usual, a steady torrent of humanity was sweeping down the concrete stairs, rushing to get on the next subway train. But then I saw something troubling. Sprawled across the steps midway down was a shabby, shirtless man lying motionless, eyes closed. No one seemed to notice. People simply stepped over his body in their rush to get home. But, shocked by the sight, I stopped to see what was wrong. And the moment I stopped, something remarkable happened. Other people stopped too. Almost instantly, there was a small circle of concern around the man. Just as spontaneously, messengers of mercy fanned out. One man went over to a hot dog stand to get him some food, a woman scurried to get him a bottle of water, another summoned a subway patrol officer who in turn radioed for help. Within minutes, the man was revived, eating happily and waiting for an ambulance. We learned he spoke only Spanish, had no money, and had been wandering the streets of Manhattan, starving. He had fainted from hunger there on the subway steps. What made the difference? Just noticing, for one. By simply stopping to take in the man's plight, I seemed to snap passers-by out of their urban trance and called him to their attention. As we tuned into his predicament, we were moved to help. No doubt, all of us upright citizens on our way home from work were susceptible to silent assumptions about that man on the stairs. Stereotypes built from walking by the hundreds of homeless who, sad to say, inhabit the streets of New York and so many other modern urban centers. Urbanites learn to manage the anxiety of seeing someone in such dire straits by reflexively shifting attention away. I think my own shift-away reflex had been altered by an article I had recently written for the New York Times on how closing mental hospitals had converted the city streets into psychiatric wards. To do research for the article, I spent several days in a van with workers for a social agency that administered to the homeless, bringing them food, offering them shelter, and coaxing the mentally ill among them, a shockingly high proportion, to come to clinics to receive their medications. For quite a while afterward, I saw homeless people through fresh eyes. In other studies using the Good Samaritan situation, researchers find that those who do stop to help typically report that on seeing the other's distress, they felt upset too, and an empathic sense of tenderness. Once one person noticed the other enough to feel empathy, the odds were very high that he would offer some help. Just hearing about someone lending a helping hand can have a unique impact, inducing a warm sense of uplift. Psychologists use the word elevation for the glow stirred by witnessing someone else's kindness. Elevation is the state reported repeatedly when people tell how they felt on seeing a spontaneous act of courage, tolerance, or compassion. Most people find themselves moved, even thrilled. The acts most commonly named as stirring elevation are helping the poor or sick, or aiding someone in a difficult predicament. But these good deeds need not be as demanding as taking in an entire family, nor as selfless as Mother Teresa working among the poor in Calcutta. Simple thoughtfulness can elicit a bit of elevation. In a study in Japan, for instance, people readily came up with accounts of kandu, times when the heart is so moved, for example, by seeing a tough-looking gang member give up his seat on a train to an elderly man. Elevation, the research suggests, may be catching. When someone sees an act of kindness, it typically stirs in them the impulse to perform one too. These social benefits may be one reason mythic tales worldwide are rife with figures who save others through their courageous deeds. Psychologists speculate that hearing a story about such kindness, when it is told vividly, has the same emotional impact as seeing the act itself. That elevation can be contagious suggests that it travels the low road. Fine-tuning. On a 5-day visit to Brazil with my son, we noticed that the people we met seemed to get friendlier day by day. The change was striking. At first, we largely sensed aloofness or reserve from the Brazilians we met, but by the 3rd day, we encountered noticeably greater warmth. On the 4th day, it followed us wherever we went, and by our trip's end, we were hugging people goodbye at the airport. Was it the people of Brazil who had changed? Certainly not. What had melted away was our own uptightness as gringos in an unfamiliar culture. Our defensive reserve had initially closed us off to the Brazilians' open, friendly manner, and it may well have signaled them to keep their distance. At the beginning of our trip, like a radio set to a slightly off-channel signal, we were too preoccupied to take in the friendliness of the people we encountered. As we relaxed and tuned into those around us, it was as though we had zeroed in on the right station, the warmth that was there all along. While we are anxious or preoccupied, we fail to register the sparkle in someone's eye, the hint of a smile, or the warm tones of voice, all prime channels for sending messages of friendliness. A technical explanation for this dynamic spotlights the limits on attention itself. Working memory, or the amount of memory that we can hold in our attention at any one moment, resides in the prefrontal cortex, the citadel of the high road. This circuitry plays a major role in allocating our attention by managing the backstage business of an interaction. For instance, it searches our memory for what to say and do, even while it attends to incoming signals and shifts our responses accordingly. As the challenges thicken, those multiple demands increasingly tax our capacity for paying attention. Signals of worry from the amygdala flood key regions of the prefrontal cortex, manifesting as preoccupations that steal attention away from whatever else we're dealing with. Distress overtaxes attention. Merely being an uptight gringo will do it. Nature puts a premium on smooth communication among members of a given species, sculpting the brain for a better fit, sometimes on the spot. In certain fish, for instance, during courtship, a female's brain secretes hormones that temporarily reshape her auditory circuits to improve their attunement to the frequencies of the male's call. Something similar can be seen in a 2-month-old baby who detects his mother approaching. He will instinctively become still, quiet his breathing a bit, turn toward her and look at her face, focus on her eyes or mouth, and orient his ears toward any sounds coming from her, all while making an expression researchers call knit brow with jaw drop. Each of these moves enhances the perceptual ability of the baby to attune to what the mother says or does. The more sharply attentive we are, the more keenly we will sense another person's inner state. We will do so more quickly and from subtler cues, in more ambiguous circumstances. Conversely, the greater our distress, the less accurately we will be able to empathize. In short, self-absorption in all its forms kills empathy, let alone compassion. When we focus on ourselves, our world contracts as our problems and preoccupations loom large. But when we focus on others, our world expands. Our own problems drift to the periphery of the mind and so seem smaller, and we increase our capacity for connection, or compassionate action. Instinctive compassion. A laboratory rat, suspended in the air by a harness, screeches and struggles. Catching sight of the imperiled rat, one of its cage mates becomes upset too and manages to come to the rescue by pressing a bar that lowers the victim safely to the ground. 6 rhesus monkeys have been trained to pull chains to get food. At one point, a seventh monkey, in full view of the others, gets a painful shock whenever one of them pulls for food. On seeing the pain of that shocked monkey, 4 of the original rhesus monkeys start pulling a different chain, one that delivers less food to them, but that inflicts no shock on the other monkey. The 5th monkey stops pulling any chain at all for 5 days, and the 6th for 12 days. That is, both starve themselves to prevent shocking the 7th monkey. Virtually from birth, when babies see or hear another baby crying in distress, they start crying, as though they too are distressed. But they rarely cry when they hear a recording of their own cries. After about 14 months of age, babies not only cry when they hear another, but they also try to relieve the other baby's suffering somehow. The older toddlers get, the less they cry, and the more they try to help. Lab rats, monkeys, and babies share an automatic impulse, one that rivets their attention on another's suffering, triggers similar distressed feelings in themselves, and leads them to try to help. Why should the same response be found in very different species? Simple. Nature conserves, preserving whatever works to use again and again. In the design of the brain, winning features are shared among various species. Human brains have vast tracts of well-proven neural architecture in common with other mammals, especially primates. The similarity across species in sympathetic distress, coupled with the impulse to help, strongly suggests a like set of underlying circuitry in the brain. In contrast to mammals, reptiles show not the least sign of empathy, even eating their own young. Although people can also ignore someone in need, that cold-heartedness seems to suppress a more primal, automatic impulse to aid another in distress. Scientific observations point to a response system that is hardwired in the human brain, no doubt involving mirror neurons, that acts when we see someone else suffering, making us instantly feel with them. The more we feel with them, the more we want to help them. This instinct for compassion arguably offers benefits in evolutionary fitness, properly defined in terms of reproductive success or how many of one's offsprings live to parent their own offspring. Over a century ago, Charles Darwin proposed that empathy, the prelude to compassionate action, has been a powerful aid to survival in nature's toolkit. Empathy lubricates sociability, and we humans are the social animal par excellence. New thinking holds that our sociability has been the primary survival strategy of primate species, including our own. The utility of friendliness can be seen today in the lives of primates in the wild, who inhabit a tooth-and-claw world akin to that of human prehistory, when relatively few infants survive to childbearing age. Take the 1,000 or so monkeys that inhabit Cayo Santiago, a remote island in the Caribbean. All descend from a single band transplanted from their native India in the 1950s. These rhesus macaques live in small groups. When they reach adolescence, the females stay, and the males leave to find their place in another group. That transition holds real dangers. As the young males try to enter an unfamiliar troop, up to 20% of them die in fights. Scientists have taken spinal fluid samples of 100 teen macaques. They find that the most outgoing monkeys have the lowest level of stress hormones and stronger immune function, and, most important, that they are best able to approach, befriend, or challenge monkeys in the new troop. These more sociable young monkeys are the ones most likely to survive. Another primate data point comes from wild baboons living near Mount Kilimanjaro. For these baboons, infancy holds great perils. In a good year, about 10% of infants die. In bad times, up to 35% die. But when biologists observed the baboon mothers, they found that those who were most companionable, who spent the most time grooming or otherwise socializing with other female baboons, had the infants most likely to survive. The biologists cite 2 reasons that a mother's friendliness may help her infant survive. For one, they are members of a clubby group who can help one another defend their babies from harassment or find better food and shelter. For another, the more grooming the mothers give and get, the more relaxed and healthy they tend to be. Sociable baboons make better mothers. Our natural pull toward others may trace back to the conditions of scarcity that shape the human brain. We can readily surmise how membership in a group would make survival in dire times more likely, and how being a lone individual competing for scarce resources with a group could be a deadly disadvantage. A trait with such powerful survival value can gradually fashion the very circuitry of the brain, since whatever proves most effective in spreading genes to future generations becomes increasingly pervasive in the genetic pool. If sociability offered humans a winning strategy throughout prehistory, so have the brain systems through which social life operates. Small wonder our inclination toward empathy, the essential connector, has such potency. An angel on earth. A head-on collision had left her car crumpled like a piece of paper. With 2 bones broken in her right leg, pinned in the wreckage, she lay there in pain and shock, helpless and confused. Then a passerby, she never found out his name, came over to her and knelt by her side. He held her hand, reassuring her while emergency workers tried to free her. Despite her pain and anxiety, he helped her stay calm. He was, as she put it later, my angel on earth. We'll never know exactly what feelings moved that angel to kneel at that woman's side to reassure her, but such compassion depends on that crucial first step: empathy. Empathy entails some degree of emotional sharing, a prerequisite to truly understanding anyone else's inner world. Mirror neurons, as one neuroscientist puts it, are what give you the richness of empathy, the fundamental mechanism that makes seeing someone hurt really hurt you. Konstantin Stanislavski, the Russian developer of the famed method for stage training, saw that an actor living a part could call up his emotional memories from the past to evoke a powerful feeling in the present. But those memories, Stanislavski taught, need not be limited to our own experiences. An actor can as well draw on the emotions of others through a bit of empathy. As the legendary acting coach advised, we must study other people and get as close to them emotionally as we can, until sympathy for them is transformed into feelings of our own. Stanislavski's advice was prescient. As it turns out, brain imaging studies reveal that when we answer the question, "How are you feeling?" we activate much of the same neural circuitry that lights up when we ask, "How is she feeling?" The brain acts almost identically when we sense our own feelings and those of another. When people are asked to imitate someone's facial expression of happiness, fear, or disgust, and thereby to generate that emotion in themselves, this intentional feeling into activates the same circuits involved when they simply observe the person, or when they spontaneously feel that emotion. As Stanislavski understood, these circuits come even more alive when empathy becomes intentional. As we notice an emotion in another person, then, we literally feel together. The greater our effort or the more intense the feelings expressed, the stronger we feel them in ourselves. Tellingly, the German word Einfühlung, which was first rendered into English in 1909 as the newly coined word empathy, more literally translates as feeling into, suggesting an inner imitation of the other person's feelings. As Theodore Lips, who imported the word empathy into English, put it, "When I observe a circus performer on a high wire, I feel I am inside him." It's as though we experience the other person's emotions in our own body. And we do. Neuroscientists say that the more active a person's mirror neuron systems, the stronger her empathy. In today's psychology, the word empathy is used in 3 distinct senses: knowing another person's feelings, feeling what that person feels, and responding compassionately to another's distress. These 3 varieties of empathy seem to describe a 1-2-3 sequence. I notice you, I feel with you, and so I act to help you. All 3 fit well with what neuroscience has learned about how the brain operates when we attune to another person, as Stephanie Preston and Frans de Waal observe in a major theory linking interpersonal perception and action. These 2 scientists are uniquely suited to make the argument. Preston has pioneered using the methods of social neuroscience to study empathy in humans, and de Waal, director of Living Links at the Yerkes Primate Center, has for decades drawn lessons for human behavior from systematic observations of primates. Preston and de Waal argue that in a moment of empathy, both our emotions and our thoughts are primed along the same lines as those of the other person. Hearing a frightened cry from someone else, we spontaneously think of what might be causing their fear. From a cognitive perspective, we share a mental representation, a set of images, associations, and thoughts about their predicament. The movement from empathy to act traverses mirror neurons. Empathy seems to have evolved from emotional contagion and so shares its neural mechanisms. Primal empathy relies on no specialized brain area, but rather involves many, depending on what we are empathizing with. We slip into the other's shoes to share what they experience. Preston has found that if someone brings to mind one of the happiest moments of her life, then imagines a similar moment from the life of one of her closest friends, the brain activates virtually the identical circuitry for these two mental acts. In other words, to understand what someone else experiences, to empathize, we utilize the same brain wiring that is active during our own experience. All communication requires that what matters for the sender also matters for the receiver. By sharing thoughts as well as feelings, two brains deploy a shorthand that gets both people on the same page immediately, without having to waste time or words explaining more pointedly what matters are at hand. Mirroring occurs whenever our perception of someone automatically activates an image or a felt sense in our own brain for what they are doing and expressing. What's on their mind occupies ours. We rely on these inner messages to sense what might be going on in the other person. After all, what does a smile or a wink, a stare or a frown mean, except as a clue to what's happening in the other person's mind? An ancient debate. Today, most people remember the 17th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes for his assertion that life in our natural state, absent any strong government, is nasty, brutish, and short, a war of all against all. Despite this tough, cynical view, however, Hobbes himself had a soft side. One day, as he walked through the streets of London, he came upon an old, sickly man who was begging for alms. Hobbes, his heart touched, immediately gave the man a generous offering. When asked by a friend if he would have done the same had there been no religious dictum or philosophical principle about helping the needy, Hobbes replied that he would. His explanation? He felt some pain himself when he saw the man's misery, and so just as giving alms to the man would relieve some of the man's suffering, it doth also ease me. This tale suggests that we have a bit of self-interest in relieving the misery of others. One school of modern economic theory, following Hobbes, argues that people give to charities in part because of the pleasure they get from imagining either the relief of those they benefit or their own relief from alleviating their sympathetic distress. Latter-day versions of this theory have tried to reduce acts of altruism to disguised acts of self-interest. In one version, compassion veils a selfish gene that tries to maximize its odds of being passed on by gathering obligations or by favoring the close relatives who carry it. Such explanations may suffice in special cases. But another viewpoint offers a more immediate and universal explanation. As the Chinese sage Mengzi, or Mencius, wrote in the 3rd century BCE, long before Hobbes, all men have a mind which cannot bear to see the suffering of others. Neuroscience now supports Mengzi's position, adding missing data to this centuries-old debate. When we see someone else in distress, similar circuits reverberate in our brain, a kind of hardwired empathic resonance that becomes the prelude to compassion. If an infant cries, her parents' brains reverberate in much the same way, which in turn automatically moves them to do something to soothe their baby's distress. Our brain has been preset for kindness. We automatically go to the aid of a child who is screaming in terror. We automatically want to hug a smiling baby. Such emotional impulses are prepotent. They elicit reactions in us that are unpremeditated and instantaneous. That this flow from empathy to action occurs with such rapid automaticity hints at circuitry dedicated to this very sequence. To feel distress stirs an urge to help. When we hear an anguished scream, it activates the same parts of our brain that experience such anguish, as well as the premotor cortex, a sign we are preparing to act. Similarly, hearing someone tell an unhappy story in doleful tones activates the listener's motor cortex, which guides movements, as well as the amygdala and related circuits for sadness. This shared state then signals the motor area of the brain, where we prepare our response for the relevant action. Our initial perception prepares us for action. To see readies us to do. The neural networks for perception and action share a common code in the language of the brain. This shared code allows whatever we perceive to lead almost instantly to the appropriate reaction. Seeing an emotional expression, hearing a tone of voice, or having our attention directed to a given topic instantly fires the neurons that message indicates. This shared code was anticipated by Charles Darwin, who, back in 1872, wrote a scholarly treatise on emotions that scientists still regard highly. Although Darwin wrote about empathy as a survival factor, a popular misreading of his evolutionary theories emphasized nature red in tooth and claw, as Tennyson phrased the notion of a relentless culling of the weak, a notion favored by social Darwinists who twisted evolutionary thinking to rationalize greed. Darwin saw every emotion as a predisposition to act in a unique way. Fear, to freeze or flee; anger, to fight; joy, to embrace, and so on. Brain imaging studies now show that at the neural level, he was right. To feel any emotion stirs the related urge to act. The low road makes that feeling-action link interpersonal. For instance, when we see someone expressing fear, even if only in the way they move or hold their body, our own brain activates the circuitry for fear. Along with this instantaneous contagion, the brain areas that prepare for fearful actions also activate. And so with each emotion, anger, joy, sadness, and so on. Emotional contagion then does more than merely spread feelings. It automatically prepares the brain for appropriate action. Nature's rule of thumb holds that a biological system should use the minimal amount of energy. Here, the brain achieves that efficiency by firing the same neurons while both perceiving and performing an action. That economizing repeats across brains. In the special case of someone in distress, the perception-action link makes coming to their aid the brain's natural tendency. To feel with stirs us to act for. To be sure, some data suggest in many situations that people tend to favor helping their loved ones over helping a stranger. Even so, emotional attunement with a stranger in distress moves us to help that person just as we would our loved ones. For instance, in one study, the more saddened people were by the plight of a displaced orphan, the more likely they were to donate money or even offer the child a temporary place to live, regardless of how much social distance they felt. The preference for helping those similar to ourselves washes away when we are face to face with someone in agony or dire straits. In a direct encounter with such a person, the primal brain-to-brain link makes us experience their suffering as our own and to immediately prepare to help. And that direct confrontation with suffering was once the rule in human affairs, in the vast period when encounters were always within feet or yards, rather than at the artificial removes of modern life. Back to that quandary of why, if the human brain contains a system designed to attune us to someone else's distress and prepare us to act to help, we don't always help. The possible answers are manifold, enumerated by countless experiments in social psychology, but the simplest answer may be that modern life militates against it. We largely relate to those in need at a distance. That separation means we experience cognitive empathy rather than the immediacy of direct emotional contagion. Or worse, we have mere sympathy where we feel sorry for the person but do not taste their distress in the least. This more removed relationship weakens the innate impulse to help. As Preston and DeWall note, in today's era of email, commuting, frequent moves, and bedroom communities, the scales are increasingly tipped against the automatic and accurate perception of others' emotional state, without which empathy is impossible. Modern-day social and virtual distances have created an anomaly in human living, though one we now take to be the norm. This separation mutes empathy, absent which altruism falters. The argument has long been made that we humans are by nature compassionate and empathic despite the occasional streak of meanness, but torrents of bad news through history have contradicted that claim, and little sound science has backed it. But try this thought experiment. Imagine the number of opportunities people around the world today might have to commit an antisocial act, from rape or murder to simple rudeness and dishonesty. Make that number the bottom of a fraction. Now, for the top value, put the number of such antisocial acts that will actually occur today. That ratio of potential to enacted meanness holds it close to 0 any day of the year. And if for the top value you put the number of benevolent acts performed in a given day, the ratio of kindness to cruelty will always be positive. The news, however, comes to us as though that ratio was reversed. Harvard's Jerome Kagan proposes this mental exercise to make a simple point about human nature. The sum total of goodness vastly outweighs that of meanness. Although humans inherit a biological bias that permits them to feel anger, jealousy, selfishness, and envy, and to be rude, aggressive, or violent, Kagan notes, they inherit an even stronger biological bias for kindness, compassion, cooperation, love, and nurture, especially toward those in need. This inbuilt ethical sense, he adds, is a biological feature of our species. With the discovery that our neural wiring tips toward putting empathy in the service of compassion, neuroscience hands philosophy a mechanism for explaining the ubiquity of the altruistic impulse. Instead of trying to explain away selfless acts, philosophers might contemplate the conundrum of the innumerable times that cruel acts are absent.